The whole purpose of Sundays with Stories is to provide alternative visions of addiction. We hear a straight recovery story all the time, and none of them is true. There isn't one straight recovery story. And if anybody wants to learn anything from what we're talking about, if somebody tries to tell them or sell them a straight recovery story, just ask them a few questions and immediately it'll turn into something else, something different, less successful, perhaps more existential, less 12-steppy. The whole 12-step paradigm is it's a fantasy that virtually never occurs. And we go a little bit out of our way to find stories that definitely don't fit into the 12-step template. And the kinds of stories we favor are people who faced adversity, which is an awful lot of people, who haven't maybe told all about it, but have fought through it on their own. And although we have a double-edged response to it, some of those people are put down for not going through the standard 12-step model. When they don't conform, they're rejected. They can't tell their story, or worse things happen to them. And they face more abuse, ironically, if supposedly they faced trauma in the past. So you have a story that you are going to navigate us through, which has some of those elements. Why don't you take us there?
You know, I've been a fan of comedy for a long time, but I've really been getting into it, maybe in a way that most people don't enjoy comedy. But I think with podcasting coming out, you get to explore whatever someone's niche is. There are all these long form conversations. I mean, look at us, where people could sort of explain their craft. And so I'm really interested in the craft of a comedian and how they got to where they are and how they think about the world. So the comedian Mark Normand is a guy who's trending and rising in popularity now. And the reason he's popular, well, he's been working hard at it a long time and he's funny. He's been in the circuit a while, so he was ready for something to happen. But eventually, I'm going to start at the end first. He pitched a comedy special, a 1-hour comedy special to Netflix. At Netflix being, it's like the same thing as having an HBO comedy special a while ago, or a 30-minute Comedy Central special whenever they were doing that. And they rejected it. They didn't think it would be right for their audience. So he made his own. He got camera people. He hired amateur cameramen to do different angles, and he just worked and pieced it together, totally piecemeal, until he got one full show's worth of material and put it out on YouTube. And this was during the coronavirus pandemic. And ever since then, he's surpassed, I think, the number of views Johan Hari's gotten on his Drugs Aren't the Problem. I think so.
It was like Johan Hari #1 or something, or there must have been a few people who were pretty big.
I mean, he's in the tens of millions of views for that comedy special. I thought it was only 7 million, but that was just on his channel. And then other people played the same thing on different channels, and he has millions on there too. So it's a guy who's sort of he's a self-powered machine. Yeah, exactly. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about his backstory, and anything I say here is nothing that you can't hear him talk about. He puts it in a funny perspective. He takes all these things and makes a joke out of it. But I thought it was interesting and very salient, apropos all the things we talk about. So when he was growing up, he was in Louisiana, and as long as he can remember, his family lived in what was called the French Quarter of Louisiana, and it was in an all-black neighborhood. His dad always wanted to, they weren't rich, they were like blue-collar people, his mom and dad. And he had a lot of troubles growing up, so he always wanted to be in this position that he could at least look rich or look like he was doing well, even if he wasn't. No, it's an all-white family in an all-black neighborhood, which made him stand out. He didn't really feel that way until he got old enough to understand that he was sort of different in that neighborhood. The one thing he remembered, it wasn't like the white or black thing that made him stand out. It was that there was this old rundown shack of a mansion that you might hear about in like a horror story or something, or see about in a horror film. It was an enormous house, and it was a mansion. but it was just completely broken, holes all over the walls, and the plumbing didn't work. They didn't have, it took a while to get running water. And so it was a cheap place. I mean, it was the same price as any of the other houses there, probably cheaper, but it looked like they were rich. So it was a part of town where people were, let's say, fighting for resources, and those parts, they did whatever they could to manage. So people were constantly, I mean, he remembers being less than 8 years old and people were robbing his house all the time. He said he remembers being 8 years old and laying in bed and knowing that sure as the sun rises, that you're just going to have times where your house is being robbed. It's almost like his house is being robbed as sure as like sometimes the toilet's not going to flush or something like that. So he just remembers laying there thinking, someone's definitely below me right now robbing the house. And that was just sort of kind of became a normal thing. No one liked it, but it became a normal thing. He says in a podcast with Theo Vaughn, he said, "We were known as the white family in the mansion. We got robbed so often that my dad installed this alarm system that would go off pretty often at like 2 a.m. I was 8 and this thing's going off. And I just thought, oh, weird. Somebody like in my living room, somebody below our house rifling through all our shit. He could come up right now and hurt or kill me. So he said it was a skittish way to grow up. They'd come home a lot.
I mean, Gabor Maté might call that a trauma.
Right. So, by the way, you can start counting trauma points as you go along, like that. What was that show? Good Life, the Good Place, where they sort of kind of count your points. But we can count trauma points as we go along. Like, is this guy traumatized? He said it was a skittish way to grow up. I'd come home, door was wide open. We just all knew we'd been robbed again. And it just felt really violating and never felt comfortable, always uneasy, always feeling like, oh, well, we could get robbed now. So eventually they called the cops. This is already, you can see how they could make a comedy out of this if it only weren't true. They called the cops so often that the cops decided, okay, look, we're going to send, you're always calling us. We're going to send 2 people to just sit there and wait for your house to get robbed. Then they'll just catch, if it's one person, then they'll at least catch the one guy. He said, okay, we're going to stake out in your living room until it gets here. And he said he remembered, he was kind of excited. He was thinking, well, this is going to probably happen again and they're going to be here. And I get to watch this guy being caught kind of in a sick way, like really, thrilled about this. But it was the one time, it's like when you bring your car to a mechanic because it's making a noise. And then as soon as you get it in the mechanic's hands, it stops making the noise. No one broke in. But he woke up and the officers had eaten all his food.
Maybe the cops
had everything out.
The guy knew that the cops were in there and didn't come in.
Right. It obviously could be that. I'm not going to break into the place where the cops are. He said they were playing clothes or something. But anyway, it didn't work out. They tried this approach and it just didn't work out. And he just remembers that the cops took all his stuff, sprawling out on their couch watching TV, eating all his food. He said, it's like we've been robbed again. The cops just came in and robbed us. So there's his childhood, a tense childhood where they're in a place they could barely afford, even though it was run down and being broken into and stuff stolen from them. You were going to say something.
Well, of course, people tell stories like this all the time, and they get used to those experiences. And it's funny, you can label it as trauma, but it's the adaptability and the new normalcy for people. And it's just great to hear him making jokes about it. Of course, the classic version of that, I might get the title wrong, is the Glass Castle or the Ice Castle.
Yeah, Glass Castle. Yeah.
I read that book continuously. She, was brought up, her father was an alcoholic, went from job to job, but a very talented engineer. She had a brother and a sister, and then another younger sister. And they would live someplace until they got kicked out of it because their parents didn't pay the rent. And, she thought that was normal. And one night, I mean, there's some famous stories in it that can just bring you to tears. It was her birthday, and her father said, well, I've got a very special present for you. And he took her out into the desert, and he named a star after her. So that star has your name. And then they commiserated and said, do you realize some poor kid is getting some kind of a stupid toy? for his or her birthday. And you're getting a star named after you. And, you know, everything about the story, it was, she, before she wrote the book, which is the greatest thing she could ever do, she was embarrassed about it. And she was afraid to tell her actual story. But I'll just tell one last part of the story. She, when she was a junior in high school and her sister was a senior, they moved to New York by themselves. And that was you know, an upgrade in their lives. And she finished high school in New York and she got a job at a local Brooklyn newspaper. And she loved it. And finally her editor said, you know, there were better writing jobs than this. And she thought it was great and said, well, don't you have to go to college for that? And the guy says, well, maybe you should think about going to college. And she says, how could I afford to go to college? And then the guy says, well, they have these things called scholarships, you know? So she applied to Barnard and got in Columbia. And then she became who she is. So, you know what? It's just amazing how people power through these experiences. They don't feel deprived in a strange way. They adjust to it. And then in some cases, they're even more rocket fuel to go ahead, like this guy Norman, who, so they turn him down at Netflix. All right, I'll have to make my own my own comedy special.
He very well put. I read that book after you mentioned it, by the way. You came to Vermont and you were talking about it, and I think I'd seen the movie, but the book, it's worth reading the book.
Measured up. There's just, well, are you going to tell the story about how about his role model and recovering his
yes. Coming up. Yeah. So he's just still in this tension. I mean, growing up, they just remained in the tension that sometimes people are going to rob them. I think I'm not imagining this. I think one time people actually came in and they tied them up and they were looking for, all right, where are the goods? And there's just this old crappy VCR, and they're angry at them that they didn't have anything good in there and left them in there. And I'm not sure how they got rescued or broke free. So that's not resolved. Meanwhile, the renovations needed to make that house livable were more than his father anticipated that he could afford. So both his father and his mother started working, and they were working all the time. And that meant leaving him at home. So not only was he in this constant state of hyper awareness or vigilance about something that might happen that's bad, and he felt like he couldn't control it. Now he didn't have really available parents either. Not that they were bad, they just weren't there. They did manage to hire someone who could, for a reasonable price, take care of Mark. And I'm not sure if he had siblings. And the person that they hired, it was, I don't know if transvestite's the right term. Forgive me if I'm not being politically correct about it. But it was a man.
Exactly.
What's that?
Wasn't gender conforming exactly.
Right. He dressed in a dress and, wore makeup and a wig and high heels, but he was a large black man, and he would stay at home with Mark and kind of watch him, make sure he got things done. And it was funny. Mark Norman was saying that there's a quote here. He said, "Funny enough, my nanny is the one who taught me to do everything since his parents weren't around. He wound up teaching me how to fight, how to put the seat up, how to go on a date with a girl, taught me how to work with cars. My parents were always working because the house was so big, we stopped being able to afford it." He said, even though we had roaches and mice, we didn't even have lights in the house. We just had these mechanic lights in our rooms. So he started looking up to this person as a role model. And he remembers that one time on his way home, this is kind of a perspective changer for him in an interesting way. He was riding his bike, and then there were three sort of thuggish people around him or bully-ish kind of people around him, around his age. I think they were older kids that wanted to steal his bike. And so they started rubbing their tires against his and surrounding him, say, "Hey, let us check out your bike." And he tried to pedal on, but they stopped him, grabbed it, pushed him off the bike, ran away, taunted him, and left. And this wasn't the first time it happened. He'd been he'd been robbed of stuff before on the streets. He had face-to-face encounters beyond just the people breaking in. So he got home, and the nanny said to him, "Oh, what's wrong?" And he tried to be avoidant about it, said just nothing. And eventually he got it out of him. Said, "Oh, what's going on?" So he told him the story about the bike. Just get in the van. We're going to go find it. So he was just thinking, all right, I'm riding with my nanny and there's a man in a dress and a van out to try to avenge the bike that I had stolen from me from these people. And they wound up, they drove around for a while, and they found the people. So they looked, and he thought he spotted the bike, the nanny did. He said, "That's yours." And so they found these guys on a stoop. They were trying to sort of reformat it, I guess, to kind of strip it down and put different parts on it to disguise it for when they sell it. And he came up to them in his dress and high heels, said, "That's not your bike." And they were just laughing at him, calling him names and being terrible to him. And he said, "All right, what are you going to do about it?" And he went out, pushed him out of the way, grabbed it, Mark Norman said he put his enormous hands on the handle of the bike and just looked at him in the eye, grabbed it, and said, "That's what I thought," and put it back in the van, took it, and then they went home. There's nothing, it's not like necessarily a value story, although you can make an argument for it. But what he got out of that was a change in perspective, that there are ways that he hadn't really thought of that you can control situations. You have maybe more control over something, or there are more things you can do to even out a situation than maybe you could imagine. And he said that sort of led him into the kind of work ethic that he now has. He's a very successful comedian, and he's always working, and he's always imagining that even though he's in some certain place, he's sort of just kind of naively imagining that he could go further than he is. And he says he relates that all back to kind of moments that he's had with this person, that being kind of a central focus in his memory.
People have somehow out of childhood, you have to emerge from childhood with agency. And there's two rough models for doing that. In one, you're kind of living on your own and you develop agencies. We kind of frown on that. And it has a lot of possible drawbacks. And then the other, your parents are perfectly good at teaching you agency, and you emerge as a very independent and self-respecting person. But people are having a lot of trouble with that second model, the part where your parents are very capable and competent, and they bring you up and they teach you to have agency. That turns out to be a little trickier than we thought, where childhood used to have a lot more. And I know you're talking to a person who's famous for burrowing through that issue, and you have a podcast. We've had a podcast on that. How do you, as a competent person, bestow competence on somebody else? And of course, there's all these. It used to be called helicopter parenting, but it's an incredibly difficult project. There's just an article in Times today, how to be a competent parent without traumatizing your child, as though, I don't know, you need a special manual for that. And so and there are two answers. One is somewhere you've got to find a role model. And it unfortunately might not be your parents, which is this story. When they look at kids who've been abused or had negative experiences, but who end up whole, they find an alternative role model, which may or may not, I don't know how easy or hard that is. At least his parents hired a role model for him. And the other way, I'm going back to the Glass Castle, their mother was really inept. Their father was an alcoholic, but very talented. Their mother was really inept, and she got a teaching job. And her mother had no idea about how to deal with everything. So she and her older sister, who was only a year or so older, started grading all its papers. They were like in middle school or high school. They took over being the teacher by taking all the papers the kids gave their mother and grading them, because they needed her they couldn't have the job, and they needed her to have the job. And so, you don't recommend that kids take over the parenting role, but that's how it worked in this case. And it's funny, one of the best stories, they ended up living, I think, in West Virginia. That's where their father came from, which was another whole trauma. But at one point, they lived with their mother's family in Houston, and somebody stole their bike, one of the kids' bikes. And she and her sister, her mother said, "Oh, I think I know who stole the bike." And they went down the block to the house where she thought they stole the bike. And her mother started doing a war dance outside and putting a hex on the house. And then she said, that should do it. And, of course, the woman who wrote the book saying, what was that? And the next day, the bike was in front of their house. So as incompetent as their mother was, there's something to learn from everybody. You've got to keep your eyes open,
He, in that line, he said, this is a quote from Mark Norman about that incident, said, "To me then forever, I always thought Enos, that was the man's name, the nanny. I thought of Enos as embodying a man." He's kind of looking for, like, how do you take control of things? How do you make things work for you? That's what a man is. I used to think about my life and these bullies and these hard times, and that they were unstoppable and that I could never beat them. And then I watched my nanny, just sort of out of typical character, beat the very bullies I thought were just unbeatable. Changed my perspective. By the way, I didn't even put this I have a document in front of me. He also wet the bed into his teens. Doesn't know what that was about. The doctors didn't really know what it was about, but he would go to sleepovers and wet the bed. It's like the one solace he got away from his home and some other safe place with people from school. He was just always so embarrassed. So he had all these things that he felt like were out of his control that he couldn't deal with. As he got into an older teenager, he started thinking, all right, maybe I can take some crazy chances. He, first of all, he became a comedian, and for whatever goofy reason, he decided, I'm just going to keep this up. I'm going to write, I'm going to do comedy. I'm going to be like a Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill, even though I'm getting $50 a week right now. I know I can do it. I'm not funny yet, but I bet I could be. And he just kept doing it. He really enjoyed it. And so he got odd jobs along the way and was able to support himself, moved out. And he finally got a little bit of a circuit that he was doing, so he could barely scrape by. It's like a minimum wage in total gig that he could have a little crappy apartment. And he was doing comedy in New York City circuit. And he was drinking a lot, because that's what you go to comedy clubs, and musicians could commiserate. You go to these clubs if you're not established yet, and you get paid in some very small amount of money plus all the beer or liquor you can drink. And so he wound up having this style of, he was working, but it was really it was backbreaking work for nothing. And so he kind of forgot his own process after a while. Like, why am I doing this? And he would have these hard nights, and then he'd come back and he'd drink a lot, and he would drink so much and he'd get blackout drunk. And he said for a while there, or as he called it, for a blip there, I had a real problem. I forgot about why I was doing this thing in the first place. And instead of enjoying any of the process, I was just sort of drinking to forget it. And I felt like it was something I just had to do, and I couldn't do anything else. So he just started he realized it and started making new connections, seeing if he could network with new people, go to new places, get bigger gigs, try to take advantage of technology and put things online so people could see them. And eventually, he kept running and doing it, taking care of himself. He talks about he became a little bit overweight. He was eating all the free food, drinking all the beer, sleeping with women and not remembering it, things like that. And he remembers trying to take it a step at a time. So he went, all right, my health, I'm just going to go to the gym once a week. I don't really want to go to the gym every day, but I bet if I go once a week, it'd be better than me doing nothing. And as far as food, he had all these weird ideas about how he could make these small changes in his life. In the meantime, while he got his mind on, well, I already am doing something about this, so he didn't have to ruminate over the problem, he said he started really enjoying his craft a lot more and seeing it for what it was. And just every time he went around the world anywhere, he was looking for what's funny about this. What's an interesting way that I'm seeing this that I could re-explain to somebody else in a way that they hadn't thought to explain before.
Which in a
Even
way,
though I know that,
sort of brought up to do in a way, because he had such
right,
an odd background,
right.
who has a giant, cross-dressing nanny. Um, how did he think about, does he call himself an alcoholic, or how does he describe that period?
He's never called himself an alcoholic. I mean, unless it's as a joke, like a really, one-time offhanded joke. He doesn't call himself an alcoholic. He just said, yeah, for a while there, I was drinking way too much. And then he talks about how but he also puts that in with, I was eating way too much. I was just not taking good care of myself. And he remembers that felt a little bit like it was tugging against what he wanted to do. So he
We
tried to
love
figure out a
tell
way to,
stories like this about people who transition through addictions. We mention them all the time, Drew Barrymore and other people. By the way, we include the story of the Glass Castle. It's in our book, Behind You, Outgrowing Addiction. We didn't mention in our book, for some reason, my mind just filed into it. A girl with an impossible name, I'm sorry, wrote a book called A Drunken Girlhood. And for some reason, she started drinking intensely, like when she was 13. And she went to Syracuse University, and she was drunk the whole time. And she describes putting on makeup when you're drunk and what that's like. And, the book caught a tremendous amount of attention, like, how was this girl abused? And, what's college life like that she did this? Did you look up her name by any chance?
yeah. Is it, I'm going to say it wrong too, because I remember it's not phonetic the way it looks, but it's Corinne Zailkakas.
Spell it.
The last name, it's Corinne, it's Koren, and it's Zailckas. For some reason, I remember the two consonants, you're pronouncing them both or something.
And so she graduated Syracuse, and she got a job writing, and she got a boyfriend, and she stopped drinking, and she has a website, and people started abusing her because he never went to AA.
Yeah.
Well, you're an alcoholic. Nobody drinks from the time they're 13. All the theories of addiction say anybody who's relied on alcohol that time, you're an alcoholic one way or the other. And then the way she said, she would respond, I just don't think of myself that way. And she's not as Corinne Zailkakas. She's not popular now because she doesn't fit a niche. People like the story of A Drunken Girlhood. They don't like the story of, well, I stopped that. I grew up and I got a life.
Just like her, did she stop drinking? By the way,
I'm not.
I don't remember that.
She's not. I don't know if she became a moderate drinker. I think she might drink occasionally.
Mark Norman talks about this period of his life that he was sort of just, he was just working too hard. He wasn't having fun, but he was doing something he felt was necessary. And then it got to a point where I felt like, I can't tell if I'm doing something that's necessary to build up or not, to build myself into who I want to be. But I know that when I'm not taking good care of myself, I'm hindering that process, even if I am doing it. So I've got to get something out of it. I got to at least believe that I have that under control. So that was his mindset. Like, my lifestyle needs to be such that I can spend my energy, my mental energy, feeling good about what I'm doing. And then I can, make something of myself.
That's another essential quality. Whatever trauma you have, if you retain an intact version of yourself as being a valuable person, well, first of all, you learn survival skills. Second of all, it's good to have a role model. And third of all, you have to somehow, and as a parent, you have to inspire in somebody an intact sense of themselves, that they shouldn't be violated. And people get that under the most remarkable circumstances. If there's one parent that's encouraging, if there's one relative that's encouraging, and maybe that's what the nanny did as well, to teach you that you deserve to be respected and to, not to be abused, and that you can, and including by yourself, and you can evaluate your life in those terms. Well, I'm doing the wrong thing because I'm harming myself, or I'm not being good to myself.
Something that really got him some extra popularity. He was already doing bigger gigs. Then the comedian Amy Schumer saw him one night and thought, "Oh, you're hilarious. All right, kind of on the spot said, do you want to open for me? How long do you have? Can you do 20-minute, 30-minute sets? All right, you can open for me." So he went on the road with Amy Schumer. She's doing arenas. And so now he's got a little bit of recognition in these arenas. And then he started doing his own shows, and nobody was showing up to the gigs, and he had to do morning radio and morning TV. And he has this viral video. Maybe I'll put it up so people can see it. I can't repeat anything on it because without the context, I just sound like a jerk. But basically, he sabotaged. One time he went to, I don't know if it was Detroit or Chicago, wherever it was. He was thinking, I'm so sick of waking up at 4 a.m. to advertise the place I'm playing to. And they're asking me these questions that they don't care. It's one of those just like, oh God, pre-crafted, no one cares questions. So he just sabotaged it and made a mockery of the show. And they were in good fun, but there was this woman interviewing him that I felt bad for because he would just make these extreme answers and be satirical and ironic about it. And that actually got him, he was just being silly and just broke the format. That actually got him some fame. And so anyway,
no, I had
it didn't all come in.
Like when I did quite a bit of TV, I write about it in my memoir, A Scientific Life on the Edge. I went on the Oprah show, and I sort of hijacked the show and started calling on people in the audience and doing what I just described to you, asking them questions about their stories, and none of their stories were held up. And, I broke the format of the show, and ironically, Ethan Nadelman had called me then, and before we ever met, he saw me on the Oprah show, and his reaction was to react in horror, how I was sort of somewhat in conflict with a whole mass of people. And but I saw it as a great thrust and parry, putting my point of view forward. And the head of the National Council of Alcoholism was also on the show with me, and he didn't say anything because he's a straight disease guy. The only difference between me and Norman was that wasn't a job recommendation for addiction work on my part.
Right.
His skill in handling and banding about and breaking the format, people would say, that works, in the comedian role.
Right. What we discussed earlier was that none of this process was linear. He doesn't have a recovery story. He doesn't say, oh man, I hit my bottom and now I need to, by the grace of God. But he doesn't have one of those stories. He just remembers a period of his life when he felt like he wasn't healthy mentally or physically. And he talks about the whole gestalt. He doesn't talk about just drinking, although he mentions it. Funny, he still drinks. He still drinks and even makes jokes sometimes. He'll do a podcast with somebody and early in the day and talk about how he's hungover. I mean, so he's trying to have a good time, and sometimes he even goes a little too far. He smokes marijuana from time to time, but what he says is he's so focused on his work now. He's famous now. I mean, he's one of the biggest comedians that there is, and this happened like seemingly overnight to an unaware audience. Probably feels like a whole lifetime event for him. He's so focused on it that he's not going to let anything get in the way of his performing well. That matters to him so much. Like, when I'm living my day-to-day life, am I enjoying it? Am I able to take it in and see it maybe differently than other people see it? See the nuances and interactions with people and situations. And can I write about it? That which gives him joy. Like, can I take that situation and write about it in a way that if I deliver it to an audience, they will think it's fun. There's some hidden gem in there that they're going to laugh at.
That skill. I mean, that's his skill, is packaging strange experiences and broadcasting. Would you say your life was nonlinear? I mean, this nonlinear thing may be more common than we encounter, wouldn't you think?
Absolutely. It's one of the reasons why his story just resonated with me. And I think maybe one of the reasons why when I'm so interested in comedians and musicians and what their lives are like, because you kind of have to do it in a non-linear way. If you're a gig kind of a person, you kind of have to do, if you're really giving your all into the thing that you love, you have to figure out what that is and how you could possibly make that work. Because I remember from trying to make all my money just playing music for a little while, people starved to death trying to do that. He's like $10 gigs here and there, and you can't, it's hard to make a living. So yes, I think that might be the rule, not the exception.
I mean, do you feel you could handle kind of just about anything now, that could come your way?
My wife and I were talking about this the other day. She looks at potential jobs when she's looking. She's not now, but when she's looking at a job, she takes a really careful look at her own CV to see if on paper the things line up with what the requirements are. And she always laughs at, if you need a PhD for a gig, I will go into an interview and try to convince them why I don't have a PhD, but I could tell you why I have life experience just the same as a PhD, or why you might want me. I'm not terrified by the idea that maybe I won't get something, or I just feel like if I'll figure out a way to make it work, that I can sink my teeth into a concept, a job, a thing, if I want to. And I agree. I think there's something nice to be said about.
I won't say that I've always been totally on top of my game, but in general, the things that other people worry about, disruptions, I feel I can handle. Ethan's commentary after seeing me on the Oprah show, and he repeats it to this day. That happened in 1989. He'll say, "Oh, I saw Stanton on the Oprah show, and he was the smartest person there, and he pissed everybody off." And so I finally said to Ethan, "Ethan, why does that matter to you so much?" I mean, Ethan's a guy who headed an organization, had to get people to give him money. He has a certain sense of, father was a rabbi. He has a certain sense of propriety that you need to get people on board. If you're going to legalize marijuana, you have to convince people. And it did, take a decade or two. But I said, "Ethan, haven't you learned that I don't think that way? The fact that everybody gets upset with me sort of doesn't penetrate my brain. I mean, I'm aware of it, but I don't go home and worry about all over it." So I've got two questions for you. Why are you so concerned that everybody like you? And I guess the correct answer is, well, that's your gig. That's how you've done what you've done. But how come you haven't realized that that's not how I think? Why aren't you, after knowing me all these decades, alert to the fact that that doesn't matter to me so much?
What do you think his answer would be?
Stanton, you'd probably be a lot better off, wouldn't you think, for everything you wanted if you didn't piss everybody off? And then I would say, well, nobody does exactly what I do, present a whole different model of addiction. And, every once in a while, Nick Heather, who's a kind of a gruff Englishman, he is a psychologist, and every once in a while he says something really insightful. He goes, "Stan, your whole personality is geared up to what your role in life is like. You obviously, you make jokes about things, you create conflict, and you don't let it overwhelm you, because that's what your whole presentation in life enables you to do, and you've done something significant that nobody else could do." So, I guess the best argument you could make is that we're each geared for the role that we have in life. And I guess the lesson to take out of that is you want to get those two things in line. I mean, at some point you want to say to yourself, well, what is it exactly that I'm trying to accomplish here? And is my personality and presentation and skill level in line with that? And talking about negative, my brother committed suicide late in life. he didn't have that lined up. He was a little offbeat like me, but he worked in a kind of corporate IT world, and it didn't come off. He never really, people liked him, but he never really squared that circle of getting who he was in line with what he needed to do in the world to get by. And that, so I'm aware that you have to meld that somehow. If and it took you a while to kind of line up your ducks so that what you were doing was in line, in keeping with where you wanted to go. Would you say that you had that alignment issue, kind of like aligning the tires in your car?
I do. And I also will say that the coronavirus pandemic is a good indicator to me. There's a dimension of having your life kind of figured out or in the right direction that I think is, if you can measure it somehow, it's crucial. And it's that if things go totally differently than you thought they might go, can you stand on your own 2 feet? And, you know, the coronavirus pandemic was not good. And I had favorable compared to many others life situation. And some of those were things that were just good moral luck that had nothing to do with me. But a lot of it, my response to it was just me being me and having the outlook that I have. And I think I was able to do a pretty darn good job in that during that pandemic and the uncertainty, making sure that my family was doing okay. Everybody's nerves were cool. I could assure that no matter what happened, I could still make money. I could still go out and do things. I could still be productive, and that we could all still be happy. Sort of like a stoic outlook on
Well,
things.
in a way, you're talking a little bit like what I said the Norman situation was. You've had some ups and downs in the past, so you're a little bit better on rocky flying than a lot of people have.
In fact, that's where I'm. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go on.
That's where I'm headed. Is that Mark Norman got to a point where he was just a workhorse, and I think he did it with good balance and making good friendships and connections and living a good life along the way. A goofy one, as you might say. I think he makes fun of himself sometimes, but a good and balanced one. And he's so centered on his purpose that when the pandemic hit, you can imagine performers out of anyone really took a hit. At least musicians can kind of, you know, you could play music and, you know, whatever the people were doing, ask for tips or just create an album. I guess comedians could kind of do that, but he's a stand-up comic. And people try to do the whole, like, oh, I'll do stand-up over Zoom thing, but it's just not the same. He went out and immediately started doing, he'd round people up on the streets and do a social distance in Central Park, get them together, pay some kid with a camera to film it, and then he'd do a stand-up set to people in Central Park. Or he would go and totally illegally, but he'd go up on a rooftop somewhere and do the same thing, or try to, you know, and it wasn't for money or whatever. He was pretty much all set in that arena. He just wanted to work on his chops, be moving and doing something. And during the coronavirus, he said that whole thing happened and people were so unsure. Everyone was off the streets. Are we all going to die? Kind of a thing. And then that shortly after that is when he found out Netflix wasn't going to accept his stand-up special. Luckily for him, he had already been doing this kind of piecing together of, hey, man, hey, kid in the audience, or you're a photographer, or someone would write him on social media, I do photography. Any offer that anyone ever gave him to, can I film your show? So yeah, sure. And then give him a VIP ticket and have him film his show. He took from all those clips of different stand-up shows, one full piece spliced together, one full comedy hour. That's how he turned this is during coronavirus. This is how he kept himself busy. And that's how he turned this. Well, the world is not able to leave their house anymore. Netflix said no to my special. I'm not able to perform my craft. Yet, that's when he put together this hour special that gets millions and millions of views and has made him much more famous than ever. And doing that kind of work and podcasting and all of that stuff, he just knew that he had to continue his purpose. It's not like he wasn't used to living during periods of time where he felt like he had no control over things. He's already lived through that, and he remembers that, you know, he's able to kind of remap and figure things out.
I mean, you could make, I don't want to take it too far, but right now, uncertainty is our future. The
Yeah.
pandemic's returning, and who knows what's happening, and whatever. There's a million uncertain things. In a way, his reaction to the pandemic is, and I think your and my reaction to it is among the best ways to react to it. And we've had experience in uncertainty. It's not like either of us, if we lose our main gig, or if he didn't have a main gig, would be completely at sea with no direction and no ability to navigate. It's almost as though when you're raising a child today, which I know you are, and I have grandchildren, somehow uncertainty and coping and being flexible has to be built into the package, along with the purpose. You have to know what you're pursuing. You have to know what your skills are. You have to develop skills. But recognizing that uncertainty is just going to be a part of the ocean that we're sailing from here on in is a key element in survival.
So now I'm going to ask a few open-ended questions just for people to think about. I'm actually going to do it in reverse order than what I planned. He still drinks. He still, once in a while, use drugs. And in his past, he felt that drinking and maybe using drugs was part of a problem that he had in his life at that time. You might ask, like, who is in a better situation? Someone who has had a problem with drinking and completely stopped now, or him, since he still drinks and even probably drinks too much sometimes, or gets drunk and drinks to intoxication sometimes. I have to say, given that he's grown up with all these traumatic situations, so he's got a house that continually was robbed, he was mugged in the streets. He had his parents had to go work and leave him at home with this person that he doesn't know, but was wearing women's clothes, and so he didn't know how to make sense of the situation. He was always had this tension. He wet the bed. he got to a point where he was trying his best to break out of the cycle that his parents had started him in, but he was probably drinking too much. And that's one way you could look at the whole thing. And on the other hand, if you look at it through a developmental lens, you could say that throughout his life, every time he had problems, both, even if you looked at his parents being unavailable through that first lens, you could also say they had the wherewithal they knew they had to hire someone to take care of him. They knew that they had to work in order to afford the place that they were living. The person who was taking care of him turned out to be a role model. And maybe that's an unorthodox kind of a way to set up a role model situation, but he managed to do it. And Mark managed to take these times in his life that were difficult for him and pour all his energy into something that was purposeful. That was his flight out of any kind of torment that he was facing in his life. I think he's in a much better position as a drinker, not even just a moderate drinker only, but someone who drinks more than maybe me or you and probably drinks too much on occasion. He's got a meaning in life and a purpose that I bet if he gets into a period of his life again that he says, well, maybe I'm drinking too much now, it would be nothing for him to bring that down a little bit or to change course, because I mean, what kind of a course change is that? It's like turning the wheel slightly to the left when he's already moved the ship.
I mean, that's anathema what you're describing to the 12-step approach, and the whole recovery movement's all about total abstinence. How do you arrive at a abstinence goal with a client or a non-abstinence goal? How do you determine that with a client?
Me personally?
Yeah, if you're working with a client dealing with a drinking thing.
Well, I make the conversation about alcohol one part of a greater conversation about life. Is that what you mean? Is that too like existential of an answer?
In a way, you don't focus on the alcohol, you focus on the functioning. I think I know that's your.
We're kind of usually I help people get to a point where they're thinking enough about their lives and what they want that the whole alcohol thing is maybe the least interesting thing out of the whole.
Into the background.
Yeah. So like maybe that's not to say that I don't have the humanity or empathy if somebody feels they have a problem and if the problem is drinking, to go over those skills and solutions with them. Of course I do. But, opening up
Do you deal with anybody currently who is a full-time abstainer or recovery outside of your, clientele?
do I know
You
someone
have a
like
friend
that?
who's in recovery?
Yes.
And is that hard to work around with the person, or do you just ignore that thing, or what?
No, we don't ignore it. We even joke about it, kind of.
I know there's
Sometimes.
one guy you kind of debate all these things about.
Oh, yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah. No, that whole thing is like, it's fun. It's always funny to me because he thinks the way that I talk about addiction, he thinks I'm saying everything that he believes, and then we get to the part where we talk about recovery. He's like, "Well, wait, recovery's good," and I think the same thing. I think he talks about life like it's this open experience that you get to put the pieces together and figure out how you want to balance it. It's never completely stable. It's always forward moving. So you have to kind of conform and figure out and keep the balance. It's like a whole thing, this passing of time thing. And he talks about that, and he talks about, drugs not necessarily causing addiction, or a lot of people who take drugs don't become addicted to them, but he still loves the idea of 12-step recovery, or just recovery in general. I tend to think, I just wonder if it's a temperamental kind of a thing. I think he might be a guy that just likes categorization because it helps him make sense in his thought process. I don't know. I
guess
I'd let him speak for
it says
himself.
something. I don't have friends in recovery. I'm a bad. That's not going to work for me. Alta Ann, and she's 92. Somewhere along the line, she stopped drinking, but that doesn't count. It was a thing, and she still drinks. She'll take some wine with some water. It's not like a big thing with her. But that, and I actually have a line that I sometimes use. I've used in my life with people. Well, at the beginning of my memoir, Scientific Life on the Edge. Here, let me hold it up. I have a friend who's a bartender, and he thinks about his drinking. And I dedicate, I have a quote to a book at the beginning, and it goes like this. Stanton's younger bartender musician friend, after the friend has had a couple of drinks and Stanton has had one beer. I don't care if you drink less, you drink as much, but take care of yourself. You quit now or forever, or you mix and match. I just want you to be okay. Bartender, I know that and I appreciate it. And then I say to him, of course, if you join AA, we're through. He starts laughing and says, I know that too. So, if he doesn't want to drink or he wants to cut back, I just want him to be okay. But if he ever joined AA, so I say that to people. You really, if you've got a drinking issue, you might want to try to come to grips with it. Because if you join AA, you and I are through. Maybe that's not much of doesn't affect your thinking, but that's what's going to happen. So maybe you should try and deal with it short of going that route,
Yeah. I was, well, I'll save that for another time. I just want to mention that there's this idea that drinking is that kind of a thing. It's just inescapable in people's minds that drinking or drugs are that kind of a thing that you just can't go a standard route with. This is what the whole concept of our podcast is about, where we're saying, yes, you can. Don't you see it all over the place? So this story today is a guy who, he couldn't be in AA or recovery. It wouldn't make any sense to him. That whole thing he doesn't see himself as that. I think he might even believe, he just doesn't have a dog in the fight. He might believe that there are people who just need that, but that's not him. Like I had a problem with drinking.
And that's part of why you love him. You're looking at him and saying, recovery, he doesn't have a brain chip for recovery.
Right, exactly. Right.
And that's why I, A, love him, B, he's a good comedian, C, he's going to survive. So I wouldn't put that brain chip in him. I'd be the last one to do it.
I think the same thing goes with trauma. So you say, was he traumatized? It's like, what does that mean? You know, I think I put up there, it's like trauma's bad. And how many times do you have to utter that tautology? I mean, it's not
our colleague
meaningless.
Eric Ferguson, his life is like unbelievable. And when I say, are you traumatized? And he just laughed and he said, oh, I've had more traumas than anybody, but no, I'm not traumatized now. I'm just a person.
All right, Stanton. Well, Mark Norman, one of my favorite comedians. I hope people check him out. I'm tempted to put up a clip of him right now, but it's so just off the wall that I
just give us a
want
quick look at him so we'll all know who you're talking about. Can you do that?
I'll put it up. Well, here, I could do it right now. Let me show you the clip of him on that show that I was talking about.
The New Day Cleveland. It is time for a little bit of a laugh. We need comedian Mark Norman in our lives. He'll be here at Hilarities this weekend. So welcome here into the studio. It's good to have you here.
Hey, good to be here. It's a pleasure. I'm a little hungover, a little gay, but just glad to be here with you, sister.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I'm very happy to be here with you too.
All right. Sorry, just hiding my erection. Yeah, this is great.
I know you just left Slyman's.
Yeah, I had Slyman's, so I'm really gonna be on the toilet later. But boy, best corned beef in the Midwest, if you ask me.
It's delicious. It's the size of your head.
Yeah, and I ate way too much, but at least everybody there was very attractive.
That's good.
No, I'm kidding.
Okay.
But
I'll stop it there. People can watch the whole clip on their own. Just the taste of his,
At least you know what he looks like. Who we're talking about. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
Well,
I'll
he's
put a
not going
link
to
to
fit into that morning news slot. He's just going to run them around in different directions.
The morning news slot would be traumatic.
So it's their problem,
Exactly. All right, Stanton. I think we've decoded another non-recovery human being out there in the zeitgeist.
Right. Good talking with you, and see you next.
Let's see you soon.